This is Rights and Wrongs, a new weekly podcast by Human Rights Watch. I'm Anthony Gale. Welcome to the show. Some governments use sports to improve their global reputations. It's called sportswashing. It isn't new, but in recent years, the practice has grown exponentially, particularly in the Gulf. Perhaps the biggest and most recent example of this is the Qatar World Cup. Qatar has a very problematic rights record. Women are second-class citizens, LGBT rights are non-existent, and foreign workers resemble indentured labourers. Rosna Begum has been keeping an eye on these issues for years. She's a senior women's rights researcher at Human Rights Watch, and she joins me now. Rosna, welcome.
Thank you.
First of all, I think the big question is, why are Gulf countries like Qatar investing so heavily in sports?
Well, sports is a really great way of public relations. If you want your country to be known out there in the world and you want it to be associated with positive things, sports is a way of being able to do that, particularly for countries that have bad human rights record. They don't want you to know that they might be imprisoning people without their rights, they might be executing people, they might be doing terrible things to women and other marginalized communities, and instead they want to associate them with the power of sports, the power of like the beautiful game of football, the positive feelings that you get when you watch a game and you watch your team succeed. They want all of those great feelings that you get from watching and attending sports to be associated with that country. And that's why sports is a really big issue for countries in the Gulf.
And I think that's very pertinent because I'm a big football fan. And speaking as a football fan, you know, what I saw in the media in the lead up to the games was glittering stadiums, slick PR, and celebrity endorsements. But with my HRW hat on, I know this display was papering over massive human suffering. I mean, can you describe what it was like for the workers delivering the games? I mean, what was the human cost?
For a country like Qatar, which won the right to host the 2022 World Cup, they needed 12 years of work to get them ready. But what this country, this was quite a small country. It had no real infrastructure to actually deliver these games. They were going to have to build almost everything from scratch. And that would have meant they needed millions of migrant workers. So now what you saw and what people would have watched is 8 stadiums, as you say, glittering. I was in one of those stadiums. It really does glitter. And miles of new roads, hundreds, more than 100 new hotels. I mean, it was incredible what you saw. But every single thing that you saw there, when football fans went to Qatar to the World Cup, every road that they drove down, every hotel they stayed in, every single stadium that they went to was built and delivered by a migrant worker. And the fact that it took millions of migrant workers to get there was not acknowledged at the very beginning when they were given the games. And the fact that even then, we knew what was going to happen. We knew migrant workers were not going to get paid their wages, that they could have ended up in debt and actually sent home worse than when they arrived, with some of them returning home in coffins, because of the fact that Qatar was not in a position to protect labor rights of its workers because of the existing immigration sponsorship system known as kafala. And this is a system that ties migrant workers' visas to their employers, giving their employers a huge amount of control over them that allows them to abuse and exploit workers. In doing so, we were expecting 12 years ago that workers were going to face huge amounts of abuse and exploitation, and that is exactly what we saw happen.
So what were the conditions like? I mean, obviously Qatar's a very hot country.
Well, firstly, when you look at the way in which the kafala system exists, when I say that they could be abused and controlled and exploited, it creates all sorts of abuses from the very beginning. When migrant workers are recruited into the country, they are not supposed to be paying fees, but the vast majority of migrant workers were paying thousands of dollars in order to be able to come to Qatar for a job. And people were profiting from those workers and paying that amount of money. So they were coming into the country already in debt, which means that it's much harder for them to leave an abusive employer at that moment. And then they are overworked and underpaid. Many of these workers were facing wage theft, where their employers just stopped paying them altogether or didn't pay them at all or didn't pay them the correct wages. Definitely were not paying them overtime compensation for a lot of workers. And then you had workers who were suffering life-changing injuries as a result of poor occupational health and safety, particularly in the early years when the World Cup when they just won the bidding of the World Cup. We really saw a lot more injuries back then as well. And then you had the conditions that were leading workers to die. Now, this is a very controversial issue where the authorities deny that the number of workers who died was because of working conditions and that they believe it was natural causes. But when you actually try to investigate what's going on in terms of workers and why were they dying, you find that the authorities were just many of these workers' deaths, migrant workers, were being chalked up to cardiac arrest. So their death certificates would say cardiac arrest. What that means is that your heart stopped. Now, all of us die because our heart stops. That's not the reason for why you died or why your heart stopped. The actual reason or the cause of your death is what you need to understand, what's going on that led to your heart stopping. But the authorities were not investigating that. So when you see migrant workers who were just dying on work sites or who were dying in their sleep, the authorities were not investigating it, even though these workers would have been at their most healthiest when they arrived because they do a lot of medical checks before they're allowed into the country to even do this work. So these are often men in their prime of their lives. And yet they were finding themselves dying in a country which is quite hot, which has a quite extensive and grueling working conditions for many workers. And the authorities were not doing enough to actually investigate that.
I'm chatting with Rosna Begum. She's a senior women's rights researcher here at Human Rights Watch. I mean, given how evidently ill-prepared Qatar was to host the tournament, all the concerns raised at the bidding process about human rights abuses, how on earth did Qatar end up being awarded this prestigious tournament by FIFA?
When Qatar won the 2022 World Cup in 2010, it was surprising to some, shocking to many, because of the fact that they didn't have the infrastructure to actually deliver these games. Now, it's fair to say that the Middle East hadn't had a World Cup, and it was important that the Middle East did get a chance to do so. But Qatar was not a country which had a huge footballing culture or a massive country with like space and stadiums to be able to deliver it. So that was a big, big question as to why they were given it. Qatar made the claim that they had the money to deliver. They actually had the money to build the infrastructure to deliver the games. And indeed, they did. They spent $220 billion on infrastructure to get those games. But what happened along the way is that they did not set up the rights framework in order to ensure that workers were going to be protected, and they were going to need millions of migrant workers to do so. And FIFA, quite crucially, didn't do its due diligence. FIFA at the time would have had business and human rights responsibilities. They were required to investigate and ensure that who they were giving the games to were going to be able to protect the rights of everyone involved, including the millions of migrant workers it was going to take to build this infrastructure. Their actual bidding report analysis says that the Qatar is going to need significant human resources to be able to deliver the games. But they don't go into is the labor conditions were already awful back then. There was already reporting by Human Rights Watch and others talking about how migrant workers were being deprived of their labor rights. I knew many migrant workers who were reporting how they were facing abuse, how they were trapped with their employer and couldn't leave them, and they were not being paid. So this was an endemic situation already happening in the country. And then they were just given the games to go ahead and build everything in order to do it without any regard for what was going to happen to migrant workers.
So, I mean, I think last week marked 6 months since the World Cup. Have we seen any steps made by FIFA or Qatar to address not only the migrant workers, but also a lot of families that are still struggling as a result of delivery of the World Cup?
Before the World Cup kicked off, we and many other organizations and worker groups, along with migrant workers and their families, called on FIFA to compensate migrant workers and their families for the abuses of the last 12 years. Now, Qatar had made a number of labor reforms within that decade, but most of these labor reforms came far too late, were far too little, or were not being implemented even though they came through. So we had so many migrant workers who were still waiting for their wages or who died and their families were never compensated. And before the World Cup even kicked off, people were suffering. They were not able to send their kids to school. They were not able to feed themselves because they went to Qatar and actually tried to and help to deliver these games. It is absolutely shocking that this World Cup kicked off without any of these abuses being redressed. Just before, we were hoping that the FIFA officials were going to address it through what is known as a legacy fund. A legacy fund is something that the FIFA does for every single World Cup event. After the games, they want to see a legacy and they create a sort of fund to do so. We were pushing for this fund to be used to compensate migrant workers for the abuses that had been committed against them. But FIFA did not come through. Instead, on the eve of the games, they deflected the entire thing, claimed it wasn't really their responsibility, and even claimed that the Qatari authorities had existing compensation mechanisms, and migrant workers should just utilize the existing mechanisms. And that was incredibly insulting because workers were trying to use those mechanisms and were not able to get their rights through them. And most of them were forced into such situations that they were impoverished, they were struggling to eat, many of them were just going home because it was too hard to try and stay and try to get any of their wages back. And there'd already been 10 years of workers who had returned home without their wages. So it was absolutely shocking that before the games kicked off, FIFA did not actually commit to compensating workers. Then by the end of the games, FIFA actually came out saying that this was the best World Cup ever, and yet they still did not compensate workers. And now 6 months on, there's nothing. There's still silence on the matter. So it is shocking that right now, FIFA is basically enjoying billions of dollars in revenue. They earn more than $7 billion over 4 years, mostly from the World Cup 2022. And at the same time, you have Qatar as a state, which was presiding over the International Labour Conference just 2 weeks ago. So we've got Qatar and FIFA who are having a great time right now, being able to enjoy what they were able to recruit out of the last World Cup. But the workers who built and delivered these games are still waiting. They're still waiting for their wages. And these families who are suffering because their loved ones died in Qatar are still waiting for compensation.
I mean, to play devil's advocate for a moment, FIFA's defence would be that politics should be kept out of sport. I mean, how do you respond to that?
Human rights is an obligation on FIFA. FIFA has those obligations. They know that, but they're trying to make it out as if it's politics, that people's lives don't matter. Of course it matters. FIFA could have only made those billions of dollars in revenue because migrant workers were delivering those games for them. None of what we saw happen in the World Cup 22 could have happened without those migrant workers. To not even give them the due wages, to make sure families are able to get compensation when their loved ones died is just horrific. That FIFA can get away by complaining that this is just politics, that we should look away. These were games that were directly built on human rights abuses. And that is something that we need to be standing up for. And we should be having fans, footballers, and many others around the world calling on FIFA to still compensate workers for these abuses. We did have a huge number of people, an umbrella of people, footballers, athletes, fan groups, unions, and several governments who did actually call for compensation for workers. But 6 months since the games ended, nothing has happened. So we still need people to stand up and call for compensation.
Obviously, we have focused on Qatar, but the problem is much bigger than one country. Recently in the media, we've seen the proposed merger of Saudi Arabia's Live Golf franchise with the PGA. And if you believe the tabloids, Saudi Arabia is hotly tipped to win the 2030 World Cup bid. This all feels eerily reminiscent of Qatar. Given the scale of new infrastructure necessary for Saudi Arabia to host the World Cup, how concerned are you that we're just going to see another repeat and the same issues are going to come to the fore?
I am incredibly concerned. Saudi Arabia is not that dissimilar to Qatar when it comes to migrant workers. In fact, their systems are sometimes much worse. So when we talk about the kafala system in Qatar, Qatar has actually amended and reformed some aspects of its labor sponsorship system, even if they have not implemented it. So it largely is this abusive immigration system that still leaves workers controlled and exploited by their employers. Saudi Arabia is very similar. They make it really difficult for workers to even leave the country without their employer's permission, where they need an exit permit to actually leave the country. That still exists. Qatar had that. They got rid of it. It's still a bit of a problem, but they did get rid of it. Saudi Arabia has changed it slightly, but it's still hard for workers to be able to leave the country. It's very hard for workers to be able to change employers. And this is yet another country which has scorching hot temperatures in parts of it. They are reliant on migrant workers who have already faced abuses. They have a much bigger migrant worker population than Qatar does already. And we have documented tons of abuses against these migrant workers. They are often brought into the country in debt, underpaid or not paid altogether. These workers are then forced into undocumented status by their employers. And then the authorities conduct these mass deportation campaigns in very abusive manner, where they often ill-treat workers as they actually deport them out of the country in the tens of thousands. This is an abuse that we've been documenting year after year in Saudi Arabia. And now they're in a position where they might be able to get the 2030 World Cup, which means that they will need to build even more infrastructure, all of which will need to be done by migrant workers who will build it or deliver it and service it. And so we're going to start to see the same kinds of abuses happening. And it's incredibly dangerous because Saudi Arabia is not in a position to even allow human rights organizations or trade unions into the country to really monitor what's going on. It's worse than Qatar in that sense, because at least with Qatar, we had an engaging relationship with the government. We could try and speak to migrant workers. In Saudi Arabia, we don't have that relationship. Saudi Arabia is not interested at all in having anyone investigate what's going on the ground. And so, and this is a country also that bans trade unions, does not allow any form of worker organization or strikes or protests. And we already know its existing current record is a very repressive atmosphere. For Saudis themselves to complain and demand their own rights, they are being arrested, detained, tortured, even executed for doing so. So this is an incredibly difficult situation where if we end up seeing Saudi Arabia win the 2030 World Cup, it's going to be bad for migrant workers, but it's also going to be bad for everyone else, for journalism, for women, and for people of LGBT backgrounds. All of these people who have been facing severe repression by the Saudi authorities, their rights record is about to be sports washed, and their situation will continue to deteriorate.
I mean, given FIFA's apparent unwillingness to address any of these issues, do you think governments need to be doing more, both to hold FIFA accountable, but to ensure that these global events aren't, simply PR platforms for human rights abusers?
Governments do need to stand up. And we did see, like, European Parliament, for instance, when it came out with its resolution in November, where they did call on FIFA to abide by its business and human rights responsibilities. And we need to see a lot more of that from governments calling on FIFA to ensure that it's abiding by its responsibilities in terms of looking at bidding requirements. So when countries are bidding to host a World Cup or one of the games, that they do so looking at whether or not it's even possible for them to do it and respect worker rights or human rights in general. If they're not able to, because they won't allow human rights monitors, they won't allow a level of civic space, you cannot give games to a state like that, because it's not possible for them to truly protect and respect and promote human rights in that country before and during the games and after the games too. So it's incredibly important that governments come out and actually make sure that FIFA is held accountable for its human rights obligations and stop deflecting from them as if they are not in any way responsible for what happens.
So, I mean, we've discussed hosting events. This is one side of the sports washing coin. Perhaps a more insidious element is how countries are now starting to buy sports teams, which effectively gives them major influence in local economies. I mean, as a big Arsenal football fan, and disclaimer, they do also have issues with sports washing with their Rwanda sponsorship, but it is something I've noticed in the Premier League. So, I mean, for example, Manchester City, now England and Europe's most successful team, is owned by the UAE. Newcastle United was recently purchased by a Saudi-led coalition, and a Qatari consortium is currently bidding for Manchester United, arguably the biggest football team in recent history. Are you concerned about the growing influence that golf is having on domestic sports? And could this influence how rigorously the UK promotes human rights in the region?
It's incredibly concerning the way in which governments of a region where they have terrible human rights records are buying up sports teams and getting involved in this way as part of sports washing efforts or a way to legitimize what's happening in their own countries. And what we're seeing is also the UK is not doing, as a government, is also not doing anything about it. This is an effort of PR that will mean it's more difficult it's both a way of legitimizing what happened, cleansing their rights record, but at the same time making it more difficult for people to speak out. If you are invested in the local economy of a specific sports team, it's difficult for that sports team to talk about it. It's difficult for those fans to really condemn this government when they know that this government is responsible for owning and financing their team that they love. And so it's incredibly important to sort of think about what they're doing. They're making it much more difficult for not just their own citizens to speak out, but for people outside of their country. They want to gag the world from talking about human rights of their own of their countries, and can do so by just throwing money around. If they can buy up the teams that you love, then it's much harder for them to be able to be criticized for what they're doing to people in their own country.
I mean, last year it was exposed that the UK Foreign Office applied pressure on the Premier League to accept the Saudi-led bid for Newcastle United. Do you think perhaps that this is evidence that sports washing is now becoming accepted practice?
It's incredible that the UK government didn't get involved to actually, look at whether or not the bidding requirements or how that's been done in a human rights responsible way, which is what the government should be doing. They, in fact, facilitated it from what the reporting has come out as. That's a huge problem. What that means is that the UK government is far more interested in helping the Saudi government wash its human rights record through sports washing. And to do so because they think that that their trading relationship would be more secure. We already see the UK contributing to human rights abuses by arming Saudi Arabia with arms sales that has been used in violations of the laws of war in countries like Yemen, which weapons used by Saudi has happened. And we have talked about the fact that the UK, has to sort of reckon with what it's been doing in terms of supplying arms to Saudi Arabia. And now we're seeing the UK government also showing that they are keen to ensure Saudi Arabia is able to buy up sports team in the country as well. Now that's incredibly shocking, and it's not shocking in the sense that this is a pattern of behavior by the UK government, but it means that we're seeing, the Gulf governments as being something that the UK authorities are reliant on. Since Brexit, we have seen a concerted effort by the UK authorities not to really call the governments out for their atrocious human rights record, but more to actually seize on trade opportunities. We've seen a real resourcing of the UK government to actually ensure that they are actually utilizing more trade opportunities with Gulf governments, particularly Saudi Arabia, where they're seeing that there's a lot of cash to be had, and with Brexit that they need to be able to seize economic opportunities for the country. But in doing so, they're not looking to actually, hold, to call out other governments for their human rights records, but actually potentially being complicit in it. We also have what's known as there's a potential agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council, which Saudi Arabia is a part of. And nowhere in that agreement have they been discussing human rights, whether it's human rights of the UK or human rights of these countries, and whether or not how these governments in all of these spaces will protect the rights of all people. Instead, we're seeing a trade potential agreement happening without regard for human rights. And that's incredibly dangerous because the UK has already been complicit in human rights abuses and may be further complicit going forward.
And I think finally, and start on a big question, end on a big question, but what needs to happen to address what is increasingly a major issue in sport? And also, if FIFA aren't doing anything, governments are failing to step up, is there anything our listeners can do to make sure this issue is brought to the table?
Well, these governments are hoping that you will only see them in a positive light, that by owning a team or hosting a game, you will associate them with the good feeling of that sport. And what could happen the other way is that you actually hold them to account. You ask the questions of why your team is who the owners of your team are, why the management is allowing a certain government to take it over, or what they're doing in terms of your football, the national football clubs, and what they're doing to call out human rights responsibilities regarding countries in which it's being hosted. It is incredibly important as any individual to try and make sure that the sporting world that you exist in is not complicit in human rights abuses, that is not actually making things worse for people around the world. It is only a beautiful game if it's not actually hurting people around the world. And so in order to do that, to make sure that happens, you can write to your politician, you can write to your football club owners, you can find a way to make your views heard that you will not tolerate and you will not be okay and stand by as these governments are attempting sports washing, but also as they, essentially abuse and exploit workers in order to deliver these games as well.
Rosna, thank you very much for joining us today. I appreciate you're very busy. It's been a fantastically interesting conversation, so thank you.
Thanks, Anthony.
You've been listening to Rights and Wrongs, a new podcast by Human Rights Watch. Our producers are Christina Varganova and Blair Palmer. Our engineer is Kosi Ogbully. I'm Anthony Gale. Join us again next week for another edition of Rights and Wrongs. Stories from the human rights frontline.